listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
And we're here for our second of our two-part Christmas specials on The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. But we're here to talk about the most recent adaptation of the famous text, which was released in 2005 by a company named Walden Media. More on that later. So it'll be interesting to see how some of the stuff we talked about in the last episode echoes in this one, Chris, but also to talk about the very specific context of this production company that people might not know a lot about. They might have seen the film, but perhaps don't know the story behind the film, and I think that's an interesting story to think about, particularly at this time of year when we're thinking about the relationship to... Chris is laughing because, as we said last week, it's actually August when we're recording this. But,
I was going to say, what time of year are you referring to, Alex?
Yeah. This time of year when we're thinking about kind of the overlap between cinema, between fantasy, between blockbusters, and indeed sort of issues like Christmas. We should probably introduce our guests. So,
yes,
we're thrilled to be joined by Nathalie Dupont, who is an associate professor at ULCO, which stands, I'm going to read this once because listeners should know how terrible my French is. So I'll give it my best shot. Université du Littoral Côte d'Opale. So we're going to call it ULCO from now on, which is its abbreviated name because we're too English to be able to do that. Nathalie is joining us today to talk about The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, thanks to her number of research interests, including the history of Hollywood studios, studio activity, blockbusters, cinema and religion, cinema and tourism. She's published on this extensively. She's written stuff more recently on Trump's America, on the relationship between tourism and Game of Thrones. She has an article coming out on Little House on the Prairie very soon, as well as an upcoming book, which we'll talk about towards the end of the podcast, called Tourism, Arts and Territories. But for the purposes of the conversation we're about to have, she's also perhaps best known, at least within fantasy circles, for her book Between Hollywood and Godlywood, The Case of Walden Media. So, Nathalie, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Nathalie, Walden Media, this is probably a company not all our listeners have heard of, if indeed any of our listeners have heard of, but they've almost certainly seen one of their most famous films, certainly if they're listening to this episode, which is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, or I guess its full title, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, as we're in the world of colons now in Hollywood studio activity. I guess to start the conversation off, could you just tell us a very little bit about who Walden Media are, and perhaps allude to why this company that perhaps a lot of people haven't heard of became the subject of a book you wrote? What was it about the company you found interesting? What should listeners know as a headline that makes this a particularly noteworthy studio within the kind of Hollywood system?
Well, Walden Media was a company created at the beginning of the 21st century by two men, Michael Flaherty and Gary Grana. Both of them have left the company now. And the aim of the company was to create films with uplifting stories linked usually to books, and entertaining films, but with uplifting stories and encouraging people to be better, etc. And behind it, there is also the man who has financed the company, because it couldn't operate without any financial backing. And that man is Philip Anschutz, and he's a rather conservative man with moral ideas, very precise moral ideas. And in fact, both men's project linked to Walden Media interested him because to him films were not where they should be. It's as if he wanted to fight evil on the screen, etc. And so he found the project of both men interesting. And that's why he decided to back their project, financially speaking.
So your book is called Walden Media, the title of which Between Hollywood and Godlywood. So perhaps that title alludes to some of the interesting things about Walden Media, and indeed Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe as a text, which is that it's sitting between two spaces. Hollywood, I think we probably can get our head around. Listeners probably have heard of that, at least. The big US film business, the big studios, profit-based, globalized mass media, Okay, we know what that is. So, what is Godlywood then, and why might it be interesting to think about this Narnia film in relationship to whatever Godlywood is?
Well, Godlywood is the word Godlywood can be used now because, of course, you have Billy Graham, who created his own studio business at the beginning of the 1950s. But at the time, the size of the Christian American film industry was rather reduced. Now, since the 1980s, you have television channels, etc. And so the size has so much expanded that you can use the term Godlywood. And it gathers all the companies producing Christian films for Christian audiences. Okay, that's a prime target. And so you have the Omega Code, for example. You have Facing the Giants, about American football coached by a pastor, a team coached by a pastor, etc. Those are films, Christian films, made by Christian companies for a Christian audience. So it's sometimes they are released in American cinemas, mainstream cinemas, essentially in the South. But usually they are released in mega churches, on DVDs, you can download them, etc. They even have a television channel. I would have to check, but I think it's called Provident Channel. I'm not sure about the term, but anyway. And they only target their own audience, Christians. Walden Media is in between because it produces films which are for that audience. I mean, the themes of Walden Media's produced films are for that audience, but they are also for a mainstream audience, okay? Because you can go to a cinema, watch The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and just see and watch an entertaining film. You can have fun watching the fawns, the evil witch being beaten, etc. And you cannot see, if you are not interested in it, you cannot see the Christian background behind it. So, I mean, when you watch another Walden Media film, Journey to the Center of the Earth, for example, there is a kind of subtext with the book, Verne's book. Okay, at one point, one of the characters says, does it mean that everything that is written in the book is real? And one of the characters answers, yes, probably. And the second level of reading could be, what is in the Bible is real. Yes, you have to take it literally, as the evangelicals do, because when I'm talking about Godlywood, I'm essentially talking about conservative evangelicals. They are moderate evangelicals, of course, but Godlywood is mainly produced by conservative evangelicals for conservative evangelicals. And so Walden Media is in between. I mean, Philip Anschutz is financing rather conservative organizations. And so it is a match, okay? And it is a link between Godlywood and Hollywood, because Hollywood has been interested in the Christian audience. It was not for many years, but with the arrival of the internet, all sorts of other entertaining devices, and that sometimes take their audience, their main audience away, they have to widen their audience and find family audiences interesting, and evangelical Christians are interesting because they are usually wealthy people. They can afford an outing to the cinema, family outing. And so why not try and call them, as long as both interests meet?
So I guess I'm interested then, is this the between in your title? Is it a tension, or is it a kind of a Venn diagram? And I guess why I'm asking this is, it sounds like we could treat the evangelical audience particularly within the United States, as a kind of just a commercial demographic, right, with its own infrastructure, its own tastes, its own kind of audience demands, and you can meet the demands of that demographic. And there isn't necessarily a tension, or at least, there's certainly not an ideological tension between meeting the demands of that demographic and also trying to do something broader. So Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe plays well to that audience, but it also can play well to a broader mainstream audience. Okay, fine. But it sounds like embedded within the company's kind of culture or infrastructure is a desire that these films aren't just sort of doing well commercially within the kind of game that they're playing. I don't mean game in a kind of pejorative sense, but the kind of commercial game they're playing, with this desire to kind of, to offer some kind of moral input, right? These films should be doing something morally with their audiences. And I guess there might be a tension there in that the more mainstream things become, often the less didactic they become in terms of their morality. So I wondered if you saw this kind of in-between status as a tension it has to negotiate, or as a kind of a way of having its cake and eating it too, so to speak.
Well, I mean, yes, it has to negotiate that kind of tension for Walden Media, though the uplifting part of stories, etc. Now the new Walden Media side is more insisting on courage, for example, films linked to courage. For Hollywood, it is definitely a business part, a business interest. For the Christians, they are interested in Hollywood films as long as they can see a use to evangelize people, to convert eventually, because that's the main target of evangelicals. You have to convert people to the evangelical faith. So it's a down-to-earth relationship, and in between that, we have Walden Media that wants to talk to mainstream audiences. Definitely, that's their prime target. And then we have the financial aspect, and Philip Anschluss agrees with that because he is a conservative Christian, and so, I mean, that's why you will never see an R-rated film produced by or co-produced by Walden Media, or something violent on television co-produced by Walden Media, because it doesn't agree with their motto. Okay, it's about uplifting stories, but they shouldn't be too violent. Okay, The Exorcist would never have been produced by Walden Media. See what I mean? So yes, there is a kind of tension. They have to take into account both sides, but I mean, they essentially talk to mainstream audiences with a moral design. And if that appeals to conservative Christians, all the better.
Yeah. So on that basis, it's interesting then that looking at their filmography, one of the films that I'm familiar with is The Star, so this kind of animated retelling of the Nativity, and so I guess my question is kind of rooted in the relationship between fantasy and animation. If they are occupying this sort of in between a sort of Hollywood as we understand it and this arena of kind of Godlywood cinema, there seems to be, looking at their filmography, a real lean into fantasy and or / animation. So there are a couple of animated examples. There are films that I'd probably include as that have a percentage of animation in them that would indicate, or visual effects in them that would indicate that they are animated. So is that need to speak to specific kinds of audiences, do you think that's well served by a lean into fantasy and animation? Because a lot of the films that are listed under Walden Media definitely straddle those two overlapping kind of categories. So it's interesting that the down to earth, there's a turn to fantasy and animation which is striking, I think, within their filmography.
Yeah, because you are talking to children, and if you are talking to children, you can have a family audience with those kind of stories. And fantasy, I mean, it's the not real part of our world, and everything that is religious is also not a real part of our world. I mean, except for evangelicals, because they take the Bible literally, and everything that happens is because God wants it. That's what they say. So, I mean, fantasy is definitely something that can talk to evangelicals and conservative Christians, and that can be used. And as they are rating for, they are targeting a mild rating, of course. Fantasy is something that interests the audiences you can get with a mild rating. I mean, PG and sometimes PG-13. But and when, as they intend, they have a publishing company, the Walden Press. And usually when you look at the books they publish, they are books for children. So no wonder fantasy is something that interests children. I mean, you are not going to interest them with Godard's films or whatever, you see what I mean? Reality is not always interesting for children once they have started growing up. So if you interest them with fantasy, that's why you have that link between Walden and fantasy film.
So what is it? So you've mentioned quite a few times it's a particularly kind of family-friendly child demographic that the company is targeting. Is that a commercial decision? Is that an ideological decision? Is it a bit of both? Can you just tease that out?
I would say it's a bit of both. First of all, because they thought that there were not enough films for that type of audience. Gary Grana was a producer before he started Walden Media, and at one point he brought back extracts from Screen to work on back home, and inadvertently his daughter watched them, and she was very much afraid, and that's how he got the idea that maybe more should be done for a young audience, more than Walt Disney films. And why not take the adaptations of children's book, Paul's, etc. So Jules Verne's films are definitely good for that type of audience. So that's a kind of mixture of both. I mean, they knew they couldn't operate in Hollywood world without a commercial point of view. It seems impossible. The Godlywood doesn't care about Hollywood. They create their films for their own audiences, etc. They operate totally apart from Hollywood. If they can have a bridge with them, all the better. But they don't care about Hollywood. Right from the beginning, what Michael Flaherty and Gary Grana wanted to do was to operate within the Hollywood world. So though they had a kind of target that was a moral one, uplifting stories, as I said, etc. You have to take the commercial point of view, and because if you don't, you are bound to fail. You are not going to succeed. Your company is going to lose money, and then it's going to go into, can't remember the name, but the accounts won't be balanced, and you will have into receivership or something like that, and that's it. It happened in the 1920s to one Christian company that was producing films but tried to reach out to a wider audience and couldn't, and then when they adapt, because the stories were too strict, so to speak, and when they had to adapt to sound, financially speaking, they couldn't. And if you want to operate within Hollywood, and to sell your films to a mainstream audience, you need the marketing departments, and you also need to export your films. And in France, if you export the Chronicles of Narnia saying, it is a Christian story, people are going to say, well, thank you very much, but I'm not interested. So you have to balance the mainstream audiences and the one you also want to which is part sometimes of the mainstream audiences. It's just offering families a wider choice among the films they can find.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you and all this kind of stuff around. I mean, I love the idea that reality is not always interesting for children, so that makes sense. I guess thinking about fantasy and animation and their historical relationship, certainly within criticism, to kind of. It's not hard to find discussions of animation that talk about them in terms of their sort of pedagogical function, or scholars of Disney writing about animated films as sort of Henry Giroud calls them portable professors. The kind of pedagogical, educational function of animation, and I'd probably level this at fantasy too, that there's a sort of, it's part of a scholarly way of and you've talked about this, Alex, a kind of scholarly way of legitimizing fantasy and animation, that the way to talk about them is to sort of discuss the ways in which they are, I don't know, quote unquote, cloaking a particular worldview and then disseminating that. And a lot of sort of ideological criticism of animation tries to critique the way in which, animation as a popular form of entertainment is sort of allowing children to think about their themselves, their bodies, social relationships. Animation and fantasy have a kind of socializing project. So it seems that Walden Media, and again looking at their filmography and thinking about the kinds of films, it seems like it's sort of, in some ways, it's an intensification of those sorts of long-standing ways that people have generally thought about fantasy and animation. Certainly, as these portable professors, this is there's something already always about animation and fantasy that seems to prime itself for that kind of analysis. And it seems like some of Walden Media's films, or certainly something like Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Charlotte's Web, Bridge of Terabithia. There's a way in which they're already primed to be engaged within that particular way, and so it seems like these kinds of films are sort of an intensification of long-standing ways that audiences have engaged with fantasy and animation. They're a really interesting kind of element to that sort of relationship. We're always really looking for that educational, the kind of political with a small p function of fantasy and animation. This seems like a really interesting way of kind of taking a group of films and thinking about how the ways in which they speak to conservative evangelicals, the way that they are also talking to mainstream audiences. But I thought that's a really interesting, having recently read on animation as portable professors and kind of Disney scholarship, it seems like this is an interesting way of thinking through that relationship that fantasy and animation have to audiences, and the sort of supposedly kind of pedagogical function that they are often deemed to have.
And they also offer young audiences, another choice to Disney's films, because Disney's films are usually rated G, Aladdin, etc., and they are now seen by teenagers as babies, film for babies. Whereas, and the offer they have, or they had, with other studios was rather maybe violent, PG-13 or something, Pirates of the Caribbean, etc. There are some violent scenes, etc. So Walden Media also saw there an opportunity to offer young teenagers with Journey to the Center of the Earth, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, films for an audience which is between very young children and older teenagers. So you have an offer there, which now with vice versa, etc., has been fulfilled. So there is.
Yeah, so there's lots I'd like to unpack there. I probably won't ask all the things I'd like to unpack in one question because we'll get ourselves in a muddle. But I'll take them one at a time. The first I think is to sort of really help. That really helps crystallize sort of. Having rewatched the film recently in preparation for this podcast, one of the contexts that we perhaps it seems inevitable to throw in there, although I'm not sure it's that interesting, is the kind of post Lord of the Rings context, because watching the movie of Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe very much feels like a kind of a younger Lord of the Rings, and I was particularly struck what you said earlier, Natalie, about violence in these movies. In that I was watching the movie this time, obviously thinking about the kind of the obvious religious subtext of Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and thinking a little bit about how I can engage with that, knowing that that would probably come up and that we would be talking about Walden Media. And quite honestly, I don't really have a lot to say about it, other than the kind of obvious beats of the story that listeners will be familiar with by now, of the Aslan kind of Jesus parallels. Really, where the film kind of seems to have its own identity as an adaptation lies in two areas, and I'll come to the second area because it links to something else you said. But the first area is just literally the kind of the sense of epicness to the tale, and the kind of protracted 30-minute action sequence that ends the movie, where we get kind of, Tilda Swinton in her fabulous furs, kind of back in New Zealand.
I understand the commercial aspect
these
of
kind
that.
of
They want a
armies
lower
of
rating and they want it
minotaurs
to play
and
well to a
fawns
certain
going at it,
demographic. I don't quite understand
and this kind of,
the
this very
the
lavish
theological,
action spectacle that by now audiences are waiting for, thanks to the kind of
less
impact
violent,
of things like Lord of the Rings and
more
Gladiator
godly.
and other films.
There's nothing.
And I wonder,
there's nothing in the
that
Lord
seems
of the
quite
Rings
interesting
that
to me,
wouldn't be,
given what we said
yes,
so
yes,
far.
there's nothing in the Lord of the Rings that wouldn't be
trying
on
to
the
kind of skew
side
its
of a
demographic
cathedral or
lower,
inside
so
a church.
violence can be an issue, but also it's kind of thinking about
grotesqueness
that as a concern. You made the kind of
is there a
comment about?
I guess I'm trying
make
to
The Exorcist.
do we know more
but obviously,
about
like The Exorcist,
the
one
kind of
might argue The
ideological
Exorcist is a
framework,
profoundly
why
religious
these films need to be
film
less
with
violent?
mass
Is it
mainstream
simply
appeal.
just
So
because it plays back to that demographic?
I guess I'm throwing lots of ideas out there, but how does that kind of that move towards actually more violence in this version of Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe rather than less? How can that be reconciled with some of the stuff we've said so far, or indeed can it be, or is it just a tension left on screen? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, both authors for The Lord of the Ring and Chronicles of Narnia, they talked, and Tolkien didn't like C.S. Lewis's books. I think he thought it was too kind, probably. Well, he didn't like it. But anyway, yes, it's a post Lord of the Rings, but look at the final battle. Edmund is wounded. Okay? You cannot see blood gushing out of his wounds. You would probably see that in another PG-13 rated films or something like that. Whereas you would watch it in The Lord of the Rings, but you do not see that. Okay? You do not see any blood. And they didn't shoot it. Okay, because that's not what they wanted. Prince Caspian is also quite violent because it's more somber. But you do not have the level of violence you have in The Lord of the Rings. All those nasty creatures you can see being created in a kind of infernal place in The Lord of the Rings. You can see them in light in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but you do not have any scenes that would have a child run and hide behind the sofa. It's not what Anschutz wanted, and it's not what they wanted too. For Hollywood and Walden Media, it's essentially business. I mean, widen your audience and you can have a family audience. But for Godlywood, it's also, if you watch it in a mega church, you can have your children watch it. Okay, you can borrow or buy the DVD, or you can now download the film and have a nice evening watching it as a family. And now that, even more so probably, because now that teenagers with their portable devices, iPad, iPhones, etc., they no longer watch films with their parents sitting on a sofa, I guess. And so it's probably one occasion you can have as a family evening or family outing to the cinema with young teenagers. I guess when they are 15 or 16, it might be more complicated to take them to the cinema with mom and dad. But it's one other thing you can have. And as I said, many evangelicals were fed up with the level of violence they saw in Hollywood films. That's why they turned away from Hollywood for many, many years after the 1920s. And then they came back during the 1950s because Ben-Hur or Moses, etc., the Ten Commandments were good entertainment and safe entertainment based on the Bibles. But when the censorship code was softened in the 1960s, suddenly those people found that Hollywood films became morally reprehensible, more violent, and of course with more sexuality visible in those films. So it's a mixture of all this.
Yeah. I find it really. It's one of those films where I was saying to Alex before we started that I actually remember going to the cinema to watch it, which is a rare occasion in and of itself. And I remember absolutely loving it for the visual effects. Which have been used. Interesting, a lot of the visual effects from the film you can find in sort of VFX manuals in terms of some of the kind of techniques and the work of moving picture company and things like this. But one of the things I found particularly striking this time around was the role of children, and beyond the fact that there are sort of child protagonists or protagonists that span, I guess, I don't know, an age between, I'm terrible at this, but like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 to sort of 15-ish, 6, something like that, maybe. I thought that the film, especially in that battle sequence, but throughout really, did a really good job of placing children. It seems obvious, but like placing children in the drama. So at the expense, in a lot of the action sequences, at the expense of the sort of the gore and the violence, there's a lot of reaction shots of the children reacting to the other children, and it kind of put me in mind of some of the work that Alex has done on sort of hesitation and having these children characters kind of looking at the fantasy. And I was kind of, one of the questions I had was post Harry Potter ? Post Lord of the Rings ? But also children plus fantasy hesitation. And I was thinking about how that plays into what the film, I don't know if you have an answer to this, Alex, or a thought on it, but there's a lot of children looking at the other children that of course enhances the sort of familial bond that they have, and the fact that they are transplanted sort of twice, once to go and live with Jim Broadbent and then again into Narnia. so of course it's doing some sort of emotional work in that sense. But I'm trying to kind of maybe connect up what you were saying, Natalie, about tempering the violence somewhat, and sort of doing something different with certain kinds of sequences, because I was sort of shocked how I was a bit shocked about how violent the end was, insofar as the slow motion of the Edmund getting stabbed, and you think, oh, okay, but the way that they do it is sort of quite interesting, use of slow motion. But again, it's often the emotion comes from the reactions of the other children looking. So I don't know, Alex, if there's anything there around sort of hesitation and children's role in fantasy and their sort of seeing the world through their eyes kind of thing.
Yes, because when you are, I don't know, 6, 8 and a young teenager, you dream of finding another world in your wardrobe. It's quite attractive. Well, that slow motion, etc., is a way to soften the violence of the battle and to soften the fact that Edmund might die and he's saved by his sister. But as I said, Walden Media wouldn't produce Harry Potter, at least the response to violence. And when you watch Harry Potter, normally you shouldn't watch it with the last 4 episodes of Harry Potter's shouldn't be watched with a very young child, because there are very impressive scenes in it, shocking scenes. I mean, if you are a responsible parent, you shouldn't have them watch that unless they are, 10 or 12, or maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I mean, there are very shocking scenes for very young children. So I think that's a way to talk to young children and young teenagers. And the way it was shot was for that target audience. That was a report that was made for Print Caspian. They said that first of all, they released it in summertime, not as the usual Christmas blockbuster. And it was said to have been a wrong decision made by Disney. Walden was upset with it. And when you look at it, it seemed that the editing was more or less targeting a more male audience, young male audience with more battles, a somber world, etc. But that led to a disappointment at the box office. Okay, it didn't get back the money they had invested in it. And so that's why they turned to a softer version in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Because it was released at Christmas once again, and you do not have that somber tone, you do not have that level of violence in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Violence between brackets, because it's not the Exorcist, Prince Caspian. But that's why it was thought to be a mistake, and it also contributed to Walden leaving the partnership with Disney. Disney had also wanted to leave because it wasn't making enough money. But there were disagreements afterwards, after the film was released, because it was targeting a more male audience, etc.
The kind of comparison with Harry Potter, actually, I think one of the interesting things is how the Potter films, let's say, and Chronicles of Narnia treat petrification, because both of them have this sort of de-animation involved, and I thought it was interesting. That was one of the ways in which I saw the kind of softening that you're talking about. In the Harry Potter films, when characters are sort of magically petrified into sort of stasis, they sort of adopt this really grotesque pose, actually, and that is very different to the sort of stone petrification that the witch's sword provides all of the different sort of inhabitants of Narnia, who are then able to then be sort of resurrected at the end when Lucy goes around with her little potion and things like this. So I couldn't help, and I think it's obviously a function of the kinds of stuff that Alex and I watch, and the kind of obvious comparisons that you can kind of create between Narnia and Lord of the Rings and Narnia and Harry Potter. But this felt like on a different register in some of the ways that you can draw comparisons between certainly the film's rendition of these narrative elements, and then think about how Narnia sort of plays with softens some of the similarities. So I thought petrification was a really interesting point of comparison that then opens the door for the way that the film then is able to treat these themes of sort of resurrection, where you have these characters that sort of come back into animation from that moment of stasis. Because I think a lot of the grotesque bits of Harry Potter are not the monsters per se, or Voldemort, or whoever it is, the Death Eaters. It's because they're very firmly rooted in the fantasy. What for me, the bits that are striking about the Harry Potter films is when violence is waged on the kind of human characters, Harry and Hermione and Ron, and what happens when, I think there's one of the Harry Potters where Hermione is sort of underwater and sort of floating. I mean, that's horrendous. So I thought that was really interesting, the way that they treat the children's bodies actually in both of those two different films. And Harry Potter, they're powerful, but they're often cast as sort of the subject to transformation and these kind of grotesque processes and potions. And whereas in Narnia, there was a lot of sort of heroic childhood. Actually, I thought that was a really strong element of the film. Sort of heroic childhood, no matter whatever age you are, whether you are sort of Lucy or whether you are
and they become king and queens of Narnia. And you can even see their older version at the end of the film, just before they come back to the wardrobe. I mean, no, they are not tortured.
No.
The last two Harry Potters, the children, Hermione is tortured. So, I mean, that level of violence is not in Walden Media films. You will never see such a scene of Hermione being tortured by Beatrix. With a wand, etc. You will not see that. And talking about petrification, it seems like the statues Edmund sees in the Queen's castle, you can clearly see the characters are in pain when they were petrified, as if they were stuck in limbo or in a purgatory, atoning for their sins or whatever. And they are saved by, that's where the Bible reading comes in. They are saved by the resurrection of Aslan, and Aslan resuscitating them and taking them out of the purgatory and back to real life, so to speak. And petrification in Harry Potter, they are just petrified. There is no signs of suffering on their faces when they have seen the basilic wandering corridors, etc. It doesn't, if I remember correctly, you can't see any pain on their faces. They are just petrified. One is with the camera, one is, I think, pointing to something or whatever. But I mean, the statues, but they are adults in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Those are adult fawns, adult centaurs being petrified. You can clearly see pain on their faces.
I wanted to. This really interesting series of threads. I hadn't spotted this. I guess I'm interested in something you said earlier, Nathalie, and I'd like to come back to it now because it seems like a good moment, which is about courage and the importance of courage within the kind of moral scheme. And you seem to hint that was something that kind of was something that was sort of conscious behind the scenes, as well as something we might read in the text. And I was, again, watching the film this time, I was struck by what was added, and what seemed to be mostly added compared to other adaptations in the novel was a focus particularly on the character of Peter as this kind of conflicted, troubled warrior. And definitely this kind of thread of him summoning a kind of courage to lead this battle. And I think it links to, helping the film place these kids right in the centre of the battle, which I think is an important thing for it to do, because actually there are other versions of this tale where the kids become, particularly when Aslan arrives, right, when you have God literally arriving on screen, 4 kids don't seem actually that particularly important anymore. And there are versions of this tale where they seem to kind of just stand and watch all this stuff happening rather than actively participating in it. So perhaps it's a Hollywood screenwriter thing where they're like, we can't do that. We have to get these kids doing something in the final act that isn't just watching Aslan kind of save Narnia. But there's this through line of stories and what the film wants you to do, and it does it right at the opening section where we get this kind of prologue in Blitz London, right, which is only really alluded to in the novel, but you get this kind of, the scene of them kind of suffering real world violence where they have to kind of go down into the shelter, and Peter has to kind of lead them down into retreat. And there's obviously this thing going on where Peter kind of wants to go to war to a certain extent. He wants, his father's at war. It's alluded that he sort of feels guilty that he's not at war. He's not fighting with others. He's also aware of his allegiance to kind of protect his younger siblings. So when the kind of Mr. Beaver says to Peter, you must fight. You're the leader. You're to be the High King. He very much says, oh no, we just need to kind of get our brother and go home, And all of that is kind of there in the source text, but it's kind of bubbling away. This kind of really brings it to the forefront. So that seems to be where the film's moral compass sort of is really injecting something new into this tale, which is to take the character of Peter, and I think I probably should put a male character, given what you've said about Prince Caspian as well, but this kind of male conflict of courage. It seemed such a striking amendment to the original tale when I was watching it that I couldn't help note when you said earlier that courage was something that the studio was particularly keen to kind of highlight or enforce. So could you say any more about kind of that, either in the film or kind of more broadly as part of the company's kind of history?
Well, I mean, for the current situation, when you look at the Walden site, I'm just checking it here just to...
Yeah, great, let's do it live.
It said that it's Walden Media is an independent film and television studio that develops and produces unique, compelling stories rooted in every kind of courage.
Interesting.
That's the current motto on their site, internet site. So they have carried on that aim to develop courage. I think their film is for children to become responsible, courageous adults with a moral compass. And when you watch those films, and if you only watch those films, you are supposed to become that kind of adult. Peter seems to be a reluctant king at one point, and then becomes a true king. And he's between the older teenager and the future adult he has to become. And he's pretty much in charge because now his dad is away at war. He has to be. I mean, maybe it was forced too early on him, but at the end of the film, he seems to be almost a young man, no longer the young teenager he was, or the older teenager he was when he entered the world of Narnia. Probably also because they all remember their adult selves. We can see at the end of the film when they are chasing Lucy, and suddenly they are young people of 20s, in their 20s, I think, and then they enter the world war back and they are thrown onto the floor as their younger versions. And I think the notion of courage, I mean, it's also to teach children to be courageous. And all the films show young teenagers being courageous, facing monsters, etc. So there is that notion that if you are like that with a moral compass, you will become a good person once you are an adult.
But so just to tease at that a bit more though, because why courage? Like that's not a particularly Christian virtue. That's I mean,
American.
It's an American. Yes, it's quite an American. Yes, okay. So it's an American
kind of bird saying. I mean, in the Christmas Tale, the Muppets Christmas Tale version.
Yes, it is an American story.
I mean,
yeah.
You have the film, a Godlywood film this time, directed by the brothers, the pastor brothers, Kendrick brothers, behind Facing the Giants. One of their films is titled Courageous. It's about policemen and what you have to do when you want to be a good policeman. So I think we have here also what appealed to Philip Anschutz is that there was a kind of echo to some American values as well, because when you see heroes in Hollywood films, they are all courageous. I'm not saying Europeans are not courageous, but that's a thread, a red line going through many American films. And when you are isolated, etc., when you are the only one standing, you have to be courageous. John Wayne is courageous. So I think that value was also in the books, but it is something they use because for them it is also what makes a Hollywood movie. You wouldn't go and watch a film with a coward. I mean, you need heroes, positive heroes, to advance in life, and that's why also Walden Media films are interesting for that on that aspect, because it is a throwback to the heroes of 1950s movies, etc. Not the anti-heroes of the 70s.
Right. Okay. So I was about to ask a question, but I think you might have answered it. But why not ask it anyway? Which is that because it sounds like, on the one hand, we're saying this company have identified a kind of gap in the market, both a spiritual and a commercial gap in the market. On the other hand, we seem to be saying that they're making movies just like all the other Hollywood movies. But actually, in that final bit, it seems to be saying there's almost a nostalgia for a kind of pre-code Hollywood going on here, a Hollywood of the 40s, 50s, early 60s, John Wayne, these kind of these figures rather than the 70s, kind of 80s. But then is that sort of what's going on here? There's a perception amongst these companies that sort of post the breaking up of the code, Hollywood hasn't really delved in kind of proper figures of virtue. They've just focused on everyday people and anti-heroes.
Anti-heroes and far too much sexuality.
Right. Okay.
Because you can have someone slicing someone, but if there is a sex scene, it's more problematic for conservative Christians.
Sure.
And I'm also reading another motto on what they do on Walden Media, and they said we create movies and television series that help all generations connect to each other through the power of storytelling. So you see, it's, as I said, it's back to family audience, and the power of storytelling, because the films we talked about are based on books and well-known books. So yeah, it is a family oriented business, so to speak. And they help and connect all generations before young adults are glued to their screens and watch their own films or download their own films in their own bedrooms, etc., etc. This is what it is about. And as you said, it's the good old days when there was Mary Poppins. And personally, I love Mary
Sure.
Poppins, etc.
Yes,
When films
absolutely.
could be watched as they were in the 20s for family audiences or etc. When the code was there to regulate, and we know that Catholics and Protestants took their part in creating the Hays Code and the Code of the 50s, etc. So it is an alliance between business and having a moral compass.
I just wanted to go back to, based on what you've both been saying, actually, going back to then the ending of the film, and I don't know whether this is in. I haven't read the stories, but the significance that is sort of placed on them returning to childhood, and I'd forgotten that happened. I'd sort of, when the battle commences and then they ride through the woods and they are young adults, as you say, in their 20s. I'd then forgotten that they then returned to childhood. So I just wondered if we could kind of probe that, because I don't know, does that add to some of the values and the sort of themes that the film is sort of developing, insofar as it's, I don't know, they come back changed, but they're allowed to sort of bear the fruits of a life that they've lived. It sort of seems a strange. There's a kind of dreamlike quality to, have they really lived there that long? And so I was just trying to get my head around the stakes, the narrative stakes, but also I guess the sort of the qualities of the film that we've already discussed, the significance of bringing them back to childhood, and allowing them to sort of live their life over again. So I just wondered if you sort of had either of you had any kind of thoughts around how that. I mean, and again, I don't know whether is it in the story? Is it in the original?
It's in the original story, but Natalie, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. But in the original story, it's almost played quite melancholically.
Right.
Like it's they have this life and they've kind of forgotten the real world, and then they kind of stumble accidentally back into the wardrobe and fall into it, and then they realise they're kids again. It ends on this kind of note of, oh, so
yeah,
what? Like basically that. Whilst this has a much more kind of, as you say, playful, victorious tone to it, doesn't it? With Jim Broadbent's kind of gleeful smile, like, right,
try me.
Okay, it's try me, yeah. Like it's almost like, I think Samuel was. It's almost like okay, you've had this adventure. Now, what are you going to do next, kind of thing?
Jim, the character played by Jim Broadbent went through the road. I think.
Yes, well, yeah. So if you're a Narnia geek, you'll know that he is the protagonist of The Magician's Nephew, who is the first person ever to go to Narnia. And certainly I think this film makes that more explicit.
Yeah. And Walden was, I mean, a company was to shoot Magician's Nephew, but it's still in limbo. I think, of course, when you come back through the wardrobe and you are 8 again, gosh, you are disappointed. You were a king. Yeah. You are back to buying lollipops and so on. But it is disappointing. But business-wise, I mean, Walden Media had the rights, not Disney. Okay, Walden Media had the adaptation rights for the 3 films. So it's a kind of cliffhanger as well. So you can have audiences rooting for what comes next, and you have it at the beginning of that scene when they are in the underground, and suddenly they all realize we are going back. And I think it's a cliffhanger for the young audience, a family audience, and at the same time showing that now you have to be almost with an adult mind trapped into a child's body.
Yeah.
And you will have to be even more courageous. And Edmund, especially in Prince Caspian and the Voyage of the Down Trader, has obviously develops an older personality in number 2 and number 3.
Yeah, I just jotted down then. So it's interesting. I'm sort of obsessed a little bit with this ending, simply because, and if I know my rhetorics of fantasy, Alex, this is one of those Portal Quest fantasies, but actually doesn't spend too much time in. You said mentioned the introduction to the film, the sort of Blitz London, and then the film doesn't spend that much time in the world that they live in, but is more interested, of course, in the fantasy world that they escape into. So it's interesting, Natalie, that you say that it's sort of equipping them for the next adventure, and of course this is to be a franchise, and of course dramatically and sort of structurally it plays with the next installment. But it's interesting that the film is not interested in that sense in equipping the children to engage or to what's the word, to equipping the children to exist, survive, have an impact on the real world, because if we're saying that their next adventure's not in the real world, it's back in Narnia. So it's interesting that the film is perhaps it's saying that they have to live with courage, but that courage is not a value that they necessarily are going to need or that they can wield in the real world. It's only really giving them, that was my understanding of it, it's giving them stakes for the next adventure, not in the real world but back in Narnia.
I would push back on that. I would say
Classic Sergeant.
I would say that certainly you could read that in some of the versions of this, but of all of them, I'd say because of the stuff with Peter and because of its kind of foregrounding of the war setting, it is quite conceivable that a 15-year-old in 1940 Britain is going to need the kind of courage that certainly a male is going to need the kind of courage that Peter has to come to embody. You know, living the life as a king is not bad preparation for turning 16, 17 in 1940s wartime Europe. So, and I think it does foreground those.
No, but only if you believe that the children are going to stay in the real world. For me, that the ending of the film is they're not going to stay in that world because they're not interested in it.
Yeah,
they're much more interested in the other world. So the things that they're being equipped for, they can't impact the world that they're in because they're not interested in it. Where they really matter is back in Narnia. So that final line of "Try me" is really the film going, they're not going to live in this world. They're going back into. In fact, they've already lived in it. They've already lived in Narnia once. They're going to go back to it. So that was my sort of tension that the wartime setting is set up so that they don't have to. They're being equipped for skills that they won't need to use in that world because it's much more interesting through the wardrobe.
Because we're about to start a Hollywood franchise.
Yeah, no. So I thought that was a kind of interesting. That was a sort of interesting comparison between the introduction and the kind of conclusion of the film. It's set up for them to not be in that world anymore because they kind of the jeopardy for them isn't. It's set up to be in that world, but they've discovered something much greater that they can impact, a series of events and a world that they can impact, and a kingdom they can overthrow in the wardrobe. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, Natalie.
Well, I mean, they have been equipped, so to speak, with the values to walk the thin line between childhood and teenagehood, and especially teenagehood and adulthood, and that's what everybody has to negotiate. It's more obvious, of course, in the second one. In the second one, all the adults of the family are not shown. You do not see their faces. The aunt, the uncle. He's reading a paper. You can hear their voices, but you cannot see the adults. And the true adults seems to be in Narnia. But I mean, it's also about becoming an adult with some values. And the opening scene with the Blitz, etc., was pretty much used to market the film to teachers, etc., with study guides to teach children about the Blitz. And the fact that some children had to be evacuated from London. You have that in Bedknobs and Broomstick.
Yeah.
It's the same situation, but I mean, it's a Disney film. It's a fantasy, but not. I mean, you see that G-rated film, whereas Narnia presents a somber version, or maybe closer to reality, but it was used to market the films to educators, the film to educators, and with specific guide explaining what the Blitz was. And there was also a link at the time with the earthquake that triggered a disaster. Can't remember now the name of the place, but that displaced many people. They had to leave their homes because of the natural catastrophe, and there was a link to the values you had to have in yourself to face those types of situations. So those were guides not for conservative Christians, they were for educators, etc., to market the films to schools, etc.
So that sounds like another strategy whereby Walden is doing this role of appealing to certain sections of the kind of religious right. It's kind of, it's speaking to Godlywood, its function as a Hollywood film, but also it's kind of using just kind of the school system as a way of highlighting the kind of educational value of these films. And I one of the things that I always think characterize this area of this era of fantasy film production is this kind of desire to make fantasy matter in some way, as in, like, it can't, because commercially the genre sort of hasn't really done very well for a very long time, and it's sort of been dismissed in the sort of late 80s as this kind of very trivial, high fantasy sword and sorcery. It's a genre for kind of geeky teenage nerds, basically. There's this kind of anxiety that, yes, these are fantasy films, but don't worry, they're also, like, really important as well. The Lord of the Rings has all these quotes on it from critics and 5 stars. It's a good fantasy film. It's one of the good ones. And the same with this, right? It's this. You can also use it to teach. You can also use it to have a religious conversation. It's not just a talking lion. Don't worry, everybody. Despite the fact that most of the spectacle of the movie revolves around a talking lion. So I think that's a really interesting point to highlight. I guess to kind of bring the conversation to a close, I wonder, this might be an unfair question. It's very speculative, but I'm aware that we've now had 2 episodes where we've kind of done a whistle stop to various adaptations of this famous text. We're due to get another one in a year or so's time, with Greta Gerwig's going to make a series of adaptations for Netflix. I wondered, Natalie, if you had any sort of speculative thoughts on what on earth you might be expecting from that, because it does not seem to be. Well, that seems to be another example of them trying to tow a lot of, or bring together a lot of different audiences here. Yeah, if Barbie was an example of a film that was both incredibly commercial and also supposedly potentially quite radical, how that tension can be reconciled. Greta Gerwig seems very good at reconciling tensions. What do you think we might expect from a 2024 Greta Gerwig version of these kind of tales?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not linked to Walden, so it's going to be different anyway. And
yes,
you were talking about fantasy. I was thinking about Stranger Things. And after the success of that,
sure.
I think they might take that into account, that you have maybe to have a more somber version of the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a possibility because teenagers download many things now. They go less to the cinema, especially it has become more expensive, more and more expensive as well. And it might be a somber version of the Chronicles of Narnia, though maybe not with the first one, apart from the battle we talked about, the way to shoot the fight, etc. We will see. I mean, it's for Netflix. The audience is different. It's a different way of watching all this. It will be definitely interesting. But there is also the Lord of the Rings that is going to have a reboot as well. So, I mean, things have moved on since 2005, etc. So we are almost 20 years later. Audiences are no longer the same. Expectations are no longer the same. The Godlywood world is still there, has its own platforms, etc. The educational aspect for Walden is always there. You were talking about the guides, Journey to the Center of the Earth, also had an educational guide linked to Verne's world, etc. I don't think there will be an educational aspect to Netflix and so on, unless, who knows? I think it will be interesting.
Yeah.
That's all I can say, unfortunately, because it's pretty hush-hush as well. So.
It is. We'll have to look forward to it. I'm interested. I wonder if the White Witch will get reclaimed a little bit. We obviously haven't talked about Tilda Swinton's performance in this film, but
which is fantastic.
Which is fantastic, isn't it? And what's fantastic about it is it never goes hysteric. And some of the previous adaptations, as fabulous as some of the actors are portraying the White Witch there's no shrillness to the performance, there's no hysteria to the performance. It's this kind of very cold, calculating depth of a character. But it'll be interesting to see what Gerwig does with that figure. Will she be the devil incarnate, or will we might find some sympathy for her? We'll have to wait and see. Also, what she does with the Father Christmas.
Oh yes, yes, it's a Christmas film. Yeah,
and it's yeah. Although I've forgotten how little winter there is in this movie. Actually, isn't it? It very quickly becomes summer compared to some of the other ones. I wonder if that was a New Zealand consideration. Maybe they shot in January there or something like that. But yeah. Anyway, before we let you go, you have a new book out. You've written much since your text, Hollywood to Godlywood, which is still available, and I would very much recommend people who are interested in this subject matter go and get a copy of it, because it's a wonderful examination.
You can download it as well.
Because we're in 2024. Because we're in 2024.
Sorry.
No. Please, it's hey, this is what we're here for. Absolutely, yeah. Please do access it. It's a wonderful text. But you also have another book that's either about to be out when listeners are listening to this, or is already out if they're listening in 2025 sometime. So this is called Tourism, Arts and Territories. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what we might hope to expect from this?
Well, it's about how different arts can lead to tourism and culture. We have, for example, an article on Welcome to the Sticks, Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis, how it has boosted tourism in underprivileged area where there is a high unemployment, etc. We also have an article on how Oxford and Cambridge benefited from welcoming shooting, etc. Movies linked to the on-the-road aspect of films and how it develops tourism. And an article also linked to tourism, linked to Charlie Chaplin in Switzerland.
Interesting.
And we also have how art can be used to develop tourism through, for example, festivals, or policies intended to welcome productions, American production, especially an article linked to the British policy to welcome and have more American productions on its soil. We also have an article on the use of the third man in Vienna, or before sunrise as well. So it's more or less the interconnection between art, tourism, and territories, how territories can benefit from it, but how they can also create something artistic then to attract tourists.
Very interesting. It seems to be a rife subject within kind of media and cultural studies right now, and one that every publication I'm reading is increasingly fascinating. So I'm looking forward to reading this collection as a sort of addition to that debate, because it's fascinating. It's a subject.
That's where I'm talking about the Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, and that's where we've got talking about the Little House on the Prairie. Oh, great. Okay, excellent.
And some link with the Trump electoral aspect, because what you can see is there are links to some kind of conservative-minded tourism in some aspects, the good old American values.
Wow.
Etc.
Brilliant.
Okay. Interesting. Look forward to reading it. That'll be out late in 2024. So by the time people are listening to this, should be now. If you're listening to this after that, the matter of fact, please go and get a copy.
I always get so confused around Christmas, Alex. What day of the week it is? Luckily for us, it's August, so that's a good. Yeah.
Don't shatter the illusion, Chris. Get back in the wardrobe. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Thank you very much for your questions.
It's been an absolute delight, and I've learnt a lot. And nice to put a face to the fabulous book. So thanks so much for joining us for your time. Listeners, you can find us on fantasy-animation.org. You can also find us on various social media accounts at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. You can use that same handle, FANANIM research at gmail.com to email us suggestions for future footnotes. What have we been talking about today that you'd like to hear 10 minutes more on? Do let us know, and we'll make sure to accommodate in the new year. Otherwise, very Merry Christmas to you all, and we'll see you in 2025 once we've reclaimed the past for ourselves. We'll see you next time.
Bye.